Okay, thanks so much for joining us tonight. My name is Kimberly Kay, and I am the Senior Contributing Editor of the Legal Insurrection blog, and I'm also the Director of Editorial Development and Operations with the Legal Insurrection Foundation. And tonight, Professor Jacobson and I will be discussing the ongoing cultural purge, what that means, what we think we can expect, but unlike some of the other live events that we've done, this is much more of a discussion. So we want to thank you for taking time out of your Sunday evening to join us, and we encourage and welcome your questions. It's what we're here for. So there will be much less of us talking and much more discussion based on what you would like to know, what you would like to hear from us, and in particular, Professor Jacobson. And so I'm going to keep it short and sweet and introduce Professor Jacobson, who is a law professor at Cornell's Law School and is also the president of the Legal Insurrection Foundation and the publisher of the Legal Insurrection blog. So without further ado, Professor Jacobson.
Hi, thank you. Thank you all for being here. I think this is our fourth event. We had 2 live streams, and we have also had a Zoom meeting reader reception. So what I'm going to do tonight is a little bit different than I've done in the past. I'm not going to speak for 40 minutes or something like that. Going to just spend 15, 20 minutes going over where we are, what I think the issues are, some of my perspective on everything that's happening. And then I know we've had a number of comments, questions submitted through the comment section of the website. And we also can take comments through Facebook chat function, which I actually can't see, but Kimberly's able to see. So she will be able to do that for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to Kimberly, you need to enable screen sharing.
Okay, you should be good to go.
Okay, great. Thank you. There we go. So now you are going to see my screen, and I have a PowerPoint, as I did last time, with the subject matter of tonight. And this is me, still clinical professor of law at Cornell Law School, still founder and president of the Legal Insurrection Foundation. For those of you who don't understand, there's the Legal Insurrection website, which is a platform for the Legal Insurrection Foundation, which is a 501c3 tax-exempt entity that we launched on March 1, 2019. And Kimberly, you're well aware of, is for the foundation, Director of Operations and Editorial Development, and also is the Senior Contributing Editor for the website. We just refer to everything casually as legal insurrection. So my overview of what is going on in the country right now is this is not political correctness. This is not what we are used to seeing, where people want you to say a certain thing, and if you don't say it, they get upset. It's so far beyond that to even call it political correctness really diminishes the issue. In my mind, what's going on now is revolutionary. And if you've studied the trajectory of revolutions, as I have, you'll see that it's much deeper what is going on now. Whether it's successful, how it ends up is a completely different story, but this is not just a political movement because it does not accept the foundations that many of us have accepted for centuries, certainly for decades, as to the nature of our society and how it should operate. The history of revolutions is that first there's intimidation and then there's societal change later on. And it's not necessarily planned. And I think what's happening now is not necessarily planned, it's more taking advantage of an opportunity. A lot of the issues that are being pushed forward and the way they're being pushed forward, and most particularly the way they're being pushed forward, have been, in a sense, in incubation for a generation in higher education and recently in the political culture. So I think what's going on now is something of opportunity as opposed to planned. It's a tearing down of history. That's how all revolutions start. That's how they all exact their revenge on society. And it's establishing a new orthodoxy. And that's what's beginning to develop now, is a new orthodoxy, the silencing of opposition. In the past, if you look at Russia, you look at China, I mean, there were millions of people killed. Now it's more nuanced, but possibly just as effective. It's mostly through what we have come to refer to as the cancel culture, instilling the fear in people about opposing what is happening, instilling the fear in people so that they remain silent. And it's also a purge of people and it always starts in academia. If you look at the history of revolutions, it was always academia that was purged first, and that's going on, and I'll go through some examples. And then it's followed by other aspects of society. So I really think the dynamic of what's going on now is revolutionary. It's not just so-called political correctness. Phase one is riots and looting and violence, which we've seen over the last few weeks, but particularly over about a 2 to 3 week time period at the very end of May to the beginning of June, first couple of weeks in June. And it really was nationwide. It was not isolated. It was not sporadic, as some people have referred to it. It was pervasive and it was very intense. The costs of that looting in the 20 largest metropolitan areas, according to one study by the Anderson Economic Group, in just the first weekend of rioting, exceeded $400 million. And that is property damage and related costs, but does not assign any cost to peaceful protests or demonstrations. And obviously there were peaceful protests and demonstrations, but there was also widespread rioting. Hundreds of millions of dollars in one weekend in major cities. That number is in the billions of dollars now. And it has been particularly hard hit in minority communities, which may take a decade or more to recover. In Minneapolis alone, Minneapolis-St. Paul, according to the local CBS station, the estimates from just the first initial spree of looting, damaging, and burning were $100 million in Minneapolis alone. So this was extremely pervasive, and it really was a shock to our national system. It was out of control rioting and looting in many major cities, almost all of them run by Democrats, almost all of them run by liberals. But this is the violent outburst which has laid the groundwork for what I think is really the longer term project here, which is a cultural purge and ideological revolution. That's going to have a much longer term and much greater impact than the rioting and the looting, because this is now a project that is being rolled out on campuses around the country, in cities around the country, in corporations around the country. And it's what I have referred to, and I think we may have even had some live event about it, and I know I've given a lot of speeches about it, what I call the campus to culture evolution. That how a lot of the worst practices of silencing speech, of insisting on orthodoxy, of projecting a negative view of the country, started on the campus and now have moved into the culture. And that's what we're seeing play out. And I think it's been enabled, one, by legitimate outrage over what happened to George Floyd and some others. We'll see how those criminal cases play out. And the history of a lot of things is that what seems to be obvious upon first viewing a video when it comes to a criminal trial may nonetheless give rise to a viable defense, and we'll see how that goes. But I think this was the spark for a lot of what has happened. I think there are other agendas involved. I think part of this also was the pandemic and the job losses. I don't think you can look at the rioting and the looting and what is going on in society and ignore the fact that for the 2 months prior to that, a lot of people were locked in their houses, lost their jobs. Tens of millions of people lost their jobs. I assume that many of the people out there breaking windows and tearing things down used to have a job and now recently became unemployed. And I don't think you can ignore that factor. I also don't think that you can ignore the 2020 anti-Trump effort. Nothing happens in this country with the media, with Democrats, with Democrat governors and Democrat mayors that is not somehow related to Donald Trump. And I think there's an anger and a frustration, an anti-Trump anger. Impeachment failed, Mueller failed, everything has failed. And now all the efforts are going into creating a turmoil in the country and problems in the country for electoral purposes. And so I think you have these three factors coming together which have enabled this effort. And social media is a big part of it. Social media has been around for a while, but I think what's going on now is everything is fed by an outrage cycle on social media. And I think, and social media, Twitter is very quick to mark tweets and, suspend people from the right of center for anything that is even abstractly suggestive of use of force. But openly, people were coordinating on Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere about the protests and the riots and other things. So I think social media has played a big part as well. If you read the blog post where we announced this event for tonight, one of the things I said was, here are some things to think about before tonight's event. And I'm going to go through a few of them, give you my thoughts about them before we turn to questions. One of them is a group, I believe it's from Britain, called the Free Speech Union, which has been tracking people who have been fired, people who've been suspended. And this is a rather remarkable thread where they go through all the cultural and academic purges that have been going on, example after example after example, merely for criticizing the Black Lives Matter movement. If you've been reading the website, you know about my situation, but mine's not the worst of what's been happening out there. There are people who have actually been fired, who've had to step down from their positions. It's broad intolerance and enforcement of orthodoxy. This thread from the Free Speech Union is now, I think it's now beyond 50. So they're accumulating examples. And just one that jumped out at me is that a curator at the Metropolitan Museum was accused by 15 colleagues of being a white supremacist. Why? Because he posted a message on Instagram saying he didn't think statues and monuments should be destroyed by mobs. And that is what is happening in this culture. It's a purge of people. And believe me, for every person like this, there will be thousands who will learn to shut up and who will learn not to participate in the public debate. And this is going on in a lot of places. It's not just academia. Another example of a professor, I believe he's from Canada, who was being investigated by his university because of the tweets that he liked. If you're familiar with Twitter, you can like a tweet. Liking a tweet doesn't mean you, in a common sense, actually like what it says. It used to be called something else. It's just a way of bookmarking it. It's a way, I think it used to be called favorite or something like that. But whatever it was, he now was investigated because someone filed a complaint at his university based on his history of which tweets he liked. Good news is I saw a tweet from him in the last day or two. The university has dropped the investigation. But just the fact that people are exposed to this has a very chilling effect on a lot of people. It's a way of getting people to shut up. This video, if you haven't seen it, I really think talks about what is going on. Let me see if I can open this. Hopefully you'll be able to hear.
Why do I even worry about some silly little statues coming down or some silly little street names changing? Why do I care? It's because the last time I didn't care about this, I was a teenager. I have already lived through this thing when I was living in Venezuela. Statues came down. Chavez didn't want that history displayed. And then he changed the street names. Then came the curriculum. Then some movies couldn't be shown on certain TV channels, and so on and so forth. You guys think it can't happen to you? I've heard this so many times, but always be on guard. Never believe something can't happen to you. You need to guard your country and your society, or it will be destroyed. We didn't believe it could happen to us. Most Venezuelans, Cubans warned us. And we're like, Venezuela, we know what freedom is like. That's not gonna happen here. Yet it happened. And there's clearly a lot of people wanting to destroy the US.
I think that's something that's really keep in mind, that things that we think can't happen here can happen here. And so don't think that all of this is just a passing phase. Another one that we highlighted on the website is that the tearing down of statues has not just been Confederate statues. Anyone who thought it would stop with Confederate statues did not understand that when it's the tearing down of history by mobs that is part of what is going on here. It's not a societal decision. And they even tore down in Wisconsin a statue of an abolitionist, because the statues themselves are now being viewed as something evil and something that needs to be torn down. It's a completely mindlessness about it. And let's see if I can get this one to work. And so this is what's going on. It's tearing things down, tearing down history for the sake of tearing down history without necessarily understanding what you're doing and why you're doing it. This one has gotten a fair amount of play, and I think it's a very, very good example of, I think we have entered a phase of almost psychological collapse with a lot of what is going on.
All have a question for you. You're white and you're telling this to two black police officers.
Yeah.
Do you see the problem with that a little bit?
No, I don't, because you know what? Just because I'm white and I haven't experienced racism myself doesn't mean I can't fight for justice. They're a part of the system. They're a part of the problem. Just because they're black doesn't mean they're not a part of the problem. I'm allowed to say this to whoever. Because I'm white, racism is a white person's problem. Racism is my problem. I need to fix it. That's why I'm here talking to all of them. Black, white, fucking brown, purple. I don't know what you're saying off your uniform. Are you afraid of police?
If you've been on a campus recently, that sort of shouting down of speakers, that yelling, that irrationality, that absolute correctness, that nothing can interfere with your view of the world is something which unfortunately has been building and now is in the culture itself. There was a call by Sean King. I don't know if you want to call him a leader, whatever you want to call him, but he's a well-known personality for smashing statues of Jesus and stained glass that present Jesus as white. And I think that that, again, is a cultural call to smash history based on racial grounds. And this is something that I think explains a lot of what has been going on. You've probably seen this one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement.
That it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories. And I think that what we really try to do is build a movement that could be utilized by many, many Black folk. I also...
One of the two founders proudly proclaiming that the founders of this movement followed a Marxist ideology. And I think a lot of what has been playing out is a reflection of that founding philosophy of the movement. Perhaps in one of the worst examples of tearing down history were the Khmer Rouge, who referred to it as year zero, the idea that cultural, heritage, religion, everything needed to be destroyed in order for a communist vanguard to implement their revolutionary goals. I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're going to get there, but it's still a similar methodology that history must be destroyed. Uncomfortable history must be destroyed. Statues must be torn down. Names must be taken out. It's starting over, so to speak, as opposed to honestly debating history. And then my favorite post, I hope some of you have read it at the website, was sent in by a new reader. And I think the point he makes is extremely important, and I'll get back to this, that you are not alone. He wrote that the spines of thousands are being strengthened by hearing of your fight. You are not alone. Before tonight, I never heard of you. If you had equivocated prior to this point, you would have been destroyed. You seemingly stood alone, but you're not alone. And he made this in a very inspirational, lengthy sort of email to me. So what do we do? What do we do in this situation? And for each of the examples I just gave you, it's just touching the surface. I could have given you 10 or 20 examples for each one that I showed you. I just tried to get a flavor, if you didn't already know it, of what's going on and what the ideology is, what the methodology is behind it. I think the first thing is don't be isolated. You are not alone. There are a lot of people who are very upset and frustrated with what's going on. and who share your views of it, but they may not want to speak about it publicly, but they might be willing to speak to you alone. So search these people out, but always remember, you are not alone. Whether it's half the country, approximately half the country, whatever it is, tens of millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of people are as disgusted with what's going on as you are. Don't believe that just because the mainstream media takes a side in this, that's the way the entire country thinks. We also need leaders, political and cultural. Our politicians need to stand up for our society and for our nation. And they need to deal with history truthfully and honestly, the good and the bad, but they have to reject the attempt to eradicate history and to eradicate a lot of our cultural landmarks. Control what you can control. You may not be able to change everything, but you might be able to change things in your community. So control what you can control and vote. Of course, as a 501c3, we cannot endorse political candidates, but no matter what the intimidation factor is, there's one place where you get to express yourself without fear of retribution, and that's in the voting booth or when you stuff that ballot that you vote by mail. So a lot of what's going on now is related to the 2020 presidential election. Let's not kid ourselves. A lot of the intimidation, a lot of the media frenzy, but you get to vote. With that, I will turn to questions that have been previously asked or people might be asking live now. Of course, as I mentioned, I cannot see the live Facebook stream.
Yes, that's what I'm here for. But just quickly, this is something that I wanted to add just a little bit to what Professor Jacobson was saying in terms of what can be done. We do get that question a lot. I think, like he mentioned, a lot of people feel very helpless, especially right now, because it looks as though the world is falling down all around us. I know, at least in terms of social media, there's been a huge flight away from platforms like Facebook and Twitter. And a lot of people have moved to Parler, which I think is great. I do think it's good that there is an opportunity for people to engage in a way where they're not being politically persecuted or ideologically persecuted in a way that is skewed. But I also think it's important not to see fleeing as the answer, because taking our ideas and taking what we believe elsewhere is not going to change anything. It's not going to move the needle. And as Professor Jacobson mentioned, getting involved is so important, and getting involved at the local level. I think a lot of times the compulsion to look at the national level as a means of change really understates the importance of being involved locally, because, and I've said this several times in our live events, but we'll say it again, if we read the news all day long, all day, every day, all weekend, all night, and the craziest of the crazy stuff is not happening at the national level. It's not coming from national figures most of the time. Every blue moon, there's something that happens. But it's always some random school board in podunk nowhere, or some crazy city council in middle of nowhere, any town, that's doing something really wild. And so the best thing you can do is to stay engaged in a way, of course, that's healthy for you, because some of it can be overwhelming and it can be emotionally taxing, but don't disengage just because it's tough. If you need the space, take the space, but stay engaged. And, you know, politics aside, relationships are where all of these things will ultimately change. So however that ends up working for you, whether it's in a volunteer opportunity, or whether it's, you know, I don't know, any kind of women's group or Knights of Columbus or anything that you're involved in, all of those are opportunities to build relationships and to share part of who you are and what you are. And ultimately, those are the things that will make the biggest change. And of course, it's something that President Reagan spoke to, right? That change begins at the dinner table, and which is still very true. So that's something I think we should all keep in mind because it is very scary right now if we're looking at this, but it's not necessarily a political issue. Culture goes so far beyond politics and parties, and I think we're seeing that now. That said, that's my 2 cents, and on to the questions. So the first question, we do have this currently on the blog. This is from Snoper Cod, and he's asking Professor Jacobson, what are you going to do about it? I realize that you may not want to reveal that publicly.
Well, we do have we can only do what we can do. And I think that's one of the things. Do what you're able to do. The pandemic, these latest issues actually fit somewhat nicely with what our mission has always been. I mean, those of you who attended any of my speeches or receptions last year, what have I been talking about? I've been talking about this campus to culture problem. And we're going to continue to do that, but I think we're going to try to advance the ball a little. One of the things we've been talking about, I'm not 100% sure it will happen, but we've been talking about perhaps an educational series done through the website, where we get to talk about various issues, because one of the things I firmly believe, and I believe this for a long time, is that we need to provide a means of education for people outside of the traditional mechanisms. So I think, as a foundation, we're going to try to get a little bit more active. As soon as campuses open up, we're going to try to get back onto campuses. We're going to do whatever we can do. And I think if enough people do that, then there can be a meaningful impact.
I completely agree. Like I was saying, we have to stay in the game. Forfeiting is just not an option, especially not at this point, and especially not when the stakes are as dire as they are. So this is a question from DS Hornet. Since a response to the BLM crowd of All Lives Matter is now considered racist, how so remains a mystery. Another reply might be, what about mine? It seems that would put them on the spot. What is your opinion of that?
Well, I think one thing you need to understand is that there's a comeback for everything. And of course they would say that, oh, sure, your life matters, but your life is not the one that's threatened in this country. So I think we really have gone astray when, as a nation, you will be fired. And I could have shown you examples of this. If you say, well, I think all lives matter, that at many corporations will be a firing offense. And I think that people need to decide for themselves. But I think arguing with certain people, they have the comebacks for it. I think it will be fruitless. That doesn't mean you shouldn't speak to people. You should. I'm always in favor of debating the issue. But I think that really shows how crazy a world we've come to. We're saying that everybody is equal. Everybody is inherently worthy. All lives matter has now become a fireable offense. I think it's just an example of where we've gone wrong.
Okay. Next question. Let's see, we have quite a few here. Let's go with, this is from Andy. This was on the blog. Is there a pragmatic end to this? If so, how?
Well, again, I think this is going to burn itself out. I think they've gone too far. I think the mindless destruction, the violence which is continuing, a lot of very racist violence perpetrated by some of these rioters against other people. I think people are going to tire of it. I think they have tired of it. You get a sense of things, and I get a sense that there is a backlash brewing, that people are about to finally say enough is enough. They're finally putting fences around some of these statues. They are finally, I think Bill Barr said the other day, they have 500 investigations going. I think people who commit violence should be prosecuted for it. I don't think the fact that you committed violence during an otherwise peaceful protest excuses your violence. And the people who have excoriated me for saying that, I think, are part of the problem. There was announced that 4 people have been charged for trying to tear down the Andrew Jackson statue. And I think there have been other ones. So there is an effort made. You know, it's when you allow lawlessness to flourish, it encourages more. And I think that there need to be prosecutions of violent people and people who are destroying public property. And I think that's one practical end to this.
And I completely agree, because I think what's happening is the fringe of the fringe of the fringe are out, and they're acting like what they're doing is completely mainstream. And what's going to happen is that it's going to cause significant unrest and distress, not only in the middle, but even left of center, to say, what in the world is going on? Because, you know, we might agree with certain progressive politics or policies, but this is way too far for us. So ultimately, I think that's where this is going. I think they're going to once again overstep quite a few boundaries, and we'll end up paying the price for that. This question comes from Bruce M. And Bruce says, since it's clear that conservative faculty are being systematically eliminated from our universities based on their political beliefs or affiliation, what can be done to afford them legal protection? Several states have laws prohibiting such discrimination, but I never hear of lawsuits brought by academics using such laws. Why is that? And he continues, on the federal level, could Title VII be amended to include political belief affiliation as a protected class? Could we perhaps find support for such amendment in equal protection principles and recognition that being free from such discrimination is a fundamental human right, as reflected not only by state laws prohibiting it, but by federal immigration law offering foreigners asylum based on such human rights? It's a really good question.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that question in terms of the status of non-liberal faculty on campuses. It's basically over. It's over. The purge is done. If you look at all the surveys, and I saw somebody the other day going through those numbers, whereas 20, 30 years ago, I think it was about 60-40 liberal to conservative, or self-identifying liberal to conservative. Now it's some astronomical number. I think 8-1, 9-1, 12-1. And if you look at the younger generation of academics, it's far worse than that. I think the number was something like 38-1. So what has happened is, over more than a generation, the purge took place not by firing people, but by not hiring them. And if you go to almost any campus and you look at who are the non-liberal faculty members, or at least openly not liberal, openly conservative, they're older faculty. I mean, that's just reality everywhere. And they're the younger cohort. And by younger, I mean, you know, anyone under 45 is almost certainly left or far left. And so it's a really bad situation. So I think affording somehow expanding the law to prevent the firing of people, whether that's possible or not, I haven't really thought through, but it's the barn has burned down already. You can't, not only has the horse escaped, but the barn has burned down. So I think people need to focus on a much more systemic approach to higher education. At the public level, obviously the public can have more input, but higher ed has moved to the left, and I don't see it coming back anytime soon. And that's why I'm a big proponent of providing alternative educational opportunities for students. That could be clubs, it could be private foundations. The number of people who listen to podcasts is enormous. The number of people who access information outside of the formality of higher education is enormous. There's one example I've written about a lot of times at the website because it relates to where I went to college, which is Hamilton College, which when I went was a fairly conservative college and now is as liberal as an Oberlin. And there's an institute called the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, which the school would not allow to be located on campus, but is off campus and services students with traditional education that they can't get on campus. And I think we need to see a lot more of that, because trying to reform higher education, I'm not saying it's not worth a try, but that's a generational project. And as of now, it's basically lost. So I think we need to find alternative ways of reaching people.
Okay. Let's see, and then this question comes from, sorry, that's my little dog down here who's wanting to participate as well. Let's see, where did this one go? Okay, there it is. Why has no one taken action? That question comes from JB. And I'm assuming that the context to that is simply that, I mean, we're seeing this happen everywhere. It took how many weeks and months and statues being felled before Trump issued an executive order reiterating protection for federal monuments and memorials. But there seems to be an incredible lack of action on the part of the authorities.
Well, I think part of this is the fact that much or most of what is happening in cities and locations controlled by liberal Democrats. Madison, Wisconsin, not a big city, but that's where they tore down the statue of the abolitionist. San Francisco, New York City, Chicago, these are all run by Democrats. And the mayors in those cities seem to have no inclination to stop this. They sympathize with it. And so that's a problem. You know, the media, because this takes place in major media markets, everything gets a lot of coverage. You would think the entire country is on fire, and it's not. Democrat-controlled cities are on fire. And so I think that's a perspective people need to keep in mind. But so that's why things are not being protected in Democrat cities, because the mayors basically agree with it. There's a limited amount the federal government can do. Perhaps should have done something sooner, but federal monuments can be protected by the federal government. And I do think things should have been done sooner to do that.
Okay, and that looks like that's all the questions that we have this evening, but I want to thank everyone for taking time to join us. We hope that this was helpful and informative. And before parting ways, it is my job and also something that I would like to offer to if you appreciate what we're doing, if you find value in the work that we publish. We are a 501c3, which means that we are purely donor supported. We are an incredibly lean organization. We all wear a lot of hats, which means that every dollar that you donate to the Legal Insurrection Foundation goes a very long way. And we're very cognizant of the fact that this is your hard-earned money that you're using to support what we're doing here. And you can donate by going to Legal Insurrection. There's a giant donate button. You can donate any way you like. There will be instructions to donate by check if you prefer to do that. You can donate via PayPal. And just remember that you're not alone. And we're always here, literally always here, online, on the blog, and elsewhere. So take courage, keep your chin up. It's all going to be okay. And again, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to Professor Jacobson for sharing his brilliant brain with us for a little while. And we hope you'll have a great Sunday evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.